requirement of the law. He never did anything that the law forbade, so no sins of omission, no sins of commission. But even though he's living under that law, and many of the conversations that he had related to the keeping of the law, he also was teaching in anticipation of his coming kingdom, because there was a transition. You may remember from reading in John 4 when he had the conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well, that she asked a question about, should I worship in this mountain or in Jerusalem? Jews say in Jerusalem. And Jesus, he said, well, let's don't talk about either one of those mountains. For the day cometh and now is when the true worshipers shall worship in spirit and in truth. So they had been worshiping on Mount Zion where the temple was all those years. But Jesus said, let's don't get bogged down in that, because it's about to change anyway. Let me just tell you about my kingdom. So that's what he's doing in this chapter. In fact, he's going to talk about in this chapter, tell it to the church. When he says that, the church doesn't even exist yet. So he is anticipating what will happen after the church is established and two brothers get at odds with one another and they're trying to work it out, and what the protocol would be for that. So he's talking about the entity, the church, that he's just said in the previous chapter we read, chapter 16, that he will build it. It's not built yet. So that was a transition time. He was living under the law, but he was talking about life in the kingdom, what it would be like in the church, his kingdom. So our key verse is 18:11. So let's read 11 together. Circle the number. For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. You want the purpose statements of Jesus? Well, this is one of them. In fact, if you want me to give you his purpose statements, I will give them to you. There are 4 of them. I'll give you the verses. I've written these on the New Testament page, the page that has the words, the New Testament on it, but you can put them wherever you want. But here are quickly the 4 purpose statements of Jesus. Matthew 28:20, to serve and give life. Well, that should be 20:28. Well, I guess both of those fit. You can reverse the numbers. So here we are at 18:11. That also fits here. So put 18:11, 28:20. To serve and give life. He did that. Then Mark 1:38 is his second purpose statement, and that is to speak the law of God. So Mark 1:38. Mark 1:38, to speak. Luke 9:56, to save. Luke 9:56, and put in parentheses after that, 19:10. Luke 19:10 was spoken to Zacchaeus, and that's his most famous mission statement. Seek and save that which is lost, which is similar to 18:11 here in Matthew. And then the last one is John 12:27, to suffer. So he came to serve, to speak, to save, to suffer. Those are his 4 purpose statements. All right, now we go back over to Matthew 18, and we'll mark a few key ideas here. Let's do some circle notes first, the key ideas to make them the content marks. So circle the question in verse 1, who is the greatest in the kingdom? Circle that. That's the first section, who is the greatest? And he's going to deal with the apostles jockeying for position, wanting to be ahead of the others, and he's going to illustrate to them, that's not what my kingdom is about. You've got it backwards. Now, also in that question you circled, you put a box around kingdom, which we have been doing all the way through the book. That's a key word. So put a box around kingdom and a circle around the whole question. Now, let's move on and put a circle around verse 12, and 100 sheep. 100 sheep. Because that section is about a parable about the 90 and 9 and the 1 and the 100. So the next circle is the question in verse 21, how oft shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? That's that section where Jesus says until 70 times 7. So don't get lost in the numbers. Don't worry about how many times you had to forgive him. Just forgive him if he repents. That's all the circle notes. We're going to circle some words later, but as far as content. All right, now let's go back over and put a box around kingdom in verse 4. Kingdom in verse 4. And in that first section, I have a Roman 1, 2, 3 note. Remember, the Roman numbers represent sermon points or ideas in a text that could be brought out that support, that would work as a sermon. So let's do 1, 2, 3. In verse 3, put your 1 beside except you be converted. Except. That's it. Except you be converted. That's number 1. Number 2 is in the same verse, become as little children. So this is, how do I get to heaven? How do I get to heaven? Well, you have to be converted, 1. 2, you have to grow. And growth in the kingdom means that you become more childlike. Trusting, loving, forgiving. Those are all characteristics of children. Then the third one is enter the kingdom or go to heaven. You shall not enter the kingdom. So those 3 ideas. Except you become, you cannot enter. So 3 practical ideas. Now let's also do in this same verse, actually the verse before, I put quotation marks around the phrase a little child. A little child. Now we're going to see a sermon about a little child. So your title for the sermon is in verse 2. But let's go down to verse 5 and see our 3 responsibilities to children. Receive a little child first. That's verse 5. So that's Roman number 1. Receive children. I would encourage you to do a study of receiving at some point. I teach general epistles, and I had never done that study until I taught 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. And that concept is found in those books about receiving your brother. And I never really thought about the responsibility we have to receive our brother and how important that is in a church. I had thought about it, but I never used that term for it. Have you ever been... We were recently out west on a trip. We went to a congregation on a Wednesday night. I won't tell you what city it was in. We got there right about the time the service started. In fact, it had started when we walked in. It had just started. But so they had a greeter who greeted us, and then another greeter. We went to the back of the, and there was a greeter there. Those 2 greeters greeted us. Then we sat down, listened. The guy had a good lesson. Then you had a break between, Wednesday night, a break between the Bible class and the devotional. And then after the service, we left. Nobody said anything to us the whole time, except those 2 greeters. Nobody came over and spoke to us. We walked out. Same guy greeted me again on the way out, because he was the greeter, I guess. I've heard people say, well, I've been to a church and nobody said anything to me, but that's the first time I'd had that experience. And I don't think we appeared to be too standoffish or hateful or anything that they wouldn't want to. I don't know. It seemed like maybe it seemed like a really good church. I don't have anything against them. The lesson was good and they seemed to get along well with others. What am I saying? I'm saying they didn't receive us. Didn't receive us. Now, that's not going to affect my faith. I'm a gospel preacher. I've been a Christian a long time. It's not going to affect me whether somebody shakes my hand and says hi to me. But what if I was a visitor from the community? Or what if I had moved there and was looking for a church home? And I went in and nobody received me. I might not go back. And that might be a barrier to receiving the gospel or to being faithful. Same thing if you're in a congregation and you got some kind of turmoil or people upset a little bit, and then people quit speaking to each other. Sits over here on this side and won't ever meet eyes with the person sitting over here, and they go out different doors. And well, if we're not really careful, somebody's going to lose a soul over that, just not receiving one another. Oh, somebody's seat. One more time you would have left, yeah. Well, that's sad. Yeah. Sometimes we don't see ourselves like other people see us. You know, I always say, I wish somebody would sit in my seat every week, because that means somebody's there that doesn't know that's where I sit. That's a good thing, you know? You can have my seat. I'll stand if I have to. We'd love to have visitors. You know, that's a good thing. Anyway, receive, and that's the first thing we're supposed to do to a little child. Make them feel welcome. So receive them. Then the second and third one are negative things. Don't do this to a little child. So the next one, if you're marking in your Bible, is in verse 6. Offend. Offend. Do not offend a little child. Now, this could be talking about a little child in the chronological sense. You know, 6 years old, 8 years old, 12 years old, whatever, a child in that sense. It may also be talking about a new convert. You've got a young person or even an adult that's become a Christian. They've been a Christian for a week, a week, a month, a year. You know, they're growing. They're not very mature yet. And so they're going to wear their feelings on their sleeves a little bit more perhaps than someone who's mature. So be careful not to offend. And then 3 is found in verse 10, and that's despise. Don't despise one of these little ones. Love children. Love children. That's true of our children, grandchildren, the other children in the church, the children in the community. It's also true of immature Christians that need us to love them and help them. So that's another lesson to be seen here about life in the kingdom in this chapter about the kingdom. Now the next section, next thing I'll have you mark is, let's go to verse 7. Verse 7, I put quotation marks around, woe to that man. Woe to that man. I could see that easily develop into a sermon. There are a lot of times the Bible will say woe. Well, just collect those. It becomes depending on who your teacher was, either a topical or a textual sermon. I would call that a textual sermon. Some people would say that's topical, but if you're collecting the same word in different verses, then they're connected as a part of the text of the Bible. It really doesn't matter what you call it. It's a good sermon, because it would help us to be able to appreciate these things God disapproves of and He will condemn, though don't do these things. So woe to that man that ... That's your lead statement, and then you have different points that follow that. Then in verse 8 and 9, let's do a connecting mark, where we draw a circle around words and then connect them. Let's do that. So you want to circle the word hand, foot, and eye. Hand, foot, eye. That's in 2 of them in verse 8, 1 of them in verse 9. And then draw a line connecting them. Because here Jesus is talking about our lesson. We've chosen this to be our life lesson from this chapter. And this is how you could word it. Ruthlessly remove every barrier to heaven. Ruthlessly remove every barrier to heaven. Now, Jesus is not talking in literal terms here. This is hyperbole, where there's an exaggeration made for emphasis. But I'll read it to you, and you can be marking that. Wherefore, if thy hand or thy foot offend thee, cut them off and cast them from thee. It is better for thee to enter into life halt or maimed, rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into everlasting fire. Verse 9, and if thine eye offend thee, pluck it out, cast it from thee. It is better for thee to enter into life with 1 eye than having 2 eyes to be cast into hell fire. So what's he saying? He's not saying we need to mutilate our bodies. He's saying, if you had the choice, if that were the choice that was presented to you, okay, cut off your foot and go to heaven, or keep your foot and go to hell, which one would you pick? We'd all say, I just want 1 foot in that case, or hand or eye. So we see, whatever it is that's hindering us, we have to rid ourselves of it. There's nothing on earth that's worth missing heaven for. And if a man would cut off his hand to go to heaven, he'll do anything. Get rid of a habit, he'll get rid of a relationship, he'll get rid of whatever it is. Now we're going to see in the next chapter, there's the man we call the rich young ruler. He fits here at this point, because he would not cut off his hand, foot, or pluck out his eye, because he was told to sell his goods, possessions, and follow me, and he went away sorrowful. So he's not going to be willing to do this. That's what Jesus is saying here. So the lesson that I remember reading years ago, I don't know if this was for a class or just preparation for lessons, but I remember reading a book about overcoming an affair or keeping a marriage together. And that book says, I thought some really practical things, but one of them was, if you're willing to, if there's been an affair, maybe with someone at work, for instance, and you are trying to break off and save your marriage, he said, quit your job and get another one. You can't keep going to work and be around that person that you have been intimate with, that you have feelings for, and expect that to be a situation that corrects itself. Quit your job. Get another job. I thought when I read that, well, that's pretty drastic. And then the more I thought about it, I thought, that's 100% right. Is your marriage worth more than your job? Yes. So you can get another job. You don't want to get another marriage. And especially if you're the guilty party, then you can't get another marriage with God's approval. So you better do whatever it takes to fix the marriage if your partner is willing for you to do that. So that's the same thing we're talking about here. You know, here's a guy trying to save his marriage. He quits his job. You say, that's drastic. Yes, drastic, but it's worth it. So here it is. Whatever it is that's keeping me out of heaven, whatever it is, it's a bad habit, it's a bad friendship, it's my job. It could be a lot of things that are really hindering me from growing spiritually and to being faithful to God and living like I should. Get rid of it. If you'd cut off your hand, you could get rid of a bad habit. If you'd cut off your hand, you could break off a friendship. If you'd cut off your foot or pluck out your eye, you could tell your friend, look, I care about you, we've been friends a long time, but I want to go to heaven, and this is not making it easy for me. I'm going to have to take I'm going to have to do something different. So that's our lesson. Ruthlessly remove. So you're going to have to do some evaluation, some prayer, and then once you come to the conclusion, this is what my problem is, deal with the problem. Don't go to the judgment day having thought, well, I could have done something else to make it to heaven, and now I'm not going to make it. Do whatever it is that is required. All right, a few more notes in this chapter. We'll move on to chapter 19, and that's got a lot of good stuff there. But before we leave 8 and 9, I've written a verb beside each of those words you just circled. The first one, do. Hand, what does a hand represent? What we do. So write do beside that. Then beside foot, write go. What do our feet do? They take us places. So do and go. In other words, what action is there in my life that needs to be corrected? And what places do I need to stop going to, or do I need to start going to? And either one would be appropriate. Some people need to stop going to the bar and start going to the church. So both of those are appropriate, to the church services, I should say. And then I, that's see. So it may be that one of the avenues the devil uses against me is lust of the eyes. So what is it that he's putting in front of my eyes that's luring me, leading me away from God? What is there? Is there some movie or some television show or something that I'm watching? Some person that I need to stay away from? Well, that might be examination, consideration, and then make a determination. Down in verse 12, I've circled the numbers here. I'm a numbers guy. I like numbers. You might not want to do this, but there are 3 numbers here, and these could be your 3 points of your sermon. 100 sheep, 1 sheep, 99 sheep. Each one of those represents a different thing. The 100 sheep, that's the whole flock. That's the church. The 1 represents the straying sheep. And then the 99 represents the faithful sheep. And we have a different responsibility in each case, especially elders. You have responsibilities that relate to the whole church. Then you have different responsibilities, more specific, that relate to those who have fallen away. A lot of times they fall away and we don't ever go check on them. We don't ever contact them. We don't ever let them know we miss you. Well, that's wrong. We can't do that. Jesus would go get them. Now, they may not come back, but it can't be because we didn't try to get them back. And then the 99 that are faithful, we have some responsibilities to them help keep them faithful, help them to grow, help them to reproduce by evangelism. Those are all things that healthy sheep do. So we want that. So we want the flock to grow. It belongs to Jesus. So we don't want to give him a flock. He gave it to us, let's just say, as an eldership. So when I became an elder, let's say, I'm not an elder, but I'm just using this illustration. So when I became elder, I could say there were, the church had 200 members. And then I served for 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, whatever. Now I'm going to give the flock back to God. Well, now I've grown it, Lord, from 200 to 25. That's not really growth, is it? Now, I'll hasten to say that I'm not saying that numerical growth is necessarily reflects faithful elders or good work. Because you might have a military base there and it closes and all the jobs go away. And you know, before you had a lot of people living there, they don't live there anymore. Well, the church would not be expected to be the same size in that city. Or it could be a factory, The kids grow up and they move away to find jobs. I know there may be other reasons, but all things being equal, Lord, I want the church to grow on my watch. I want there to be a larger flock because we've been reproducing and growing, which a healthy flock would do. All right. Verse 15. Quotation marks around, if thy brother trespass against thee. Okay. There's not a person in this room or watching this, or we'll see it later, who would say, nobody's ever offended me or sinned against me in the church. Unless you were baptized yesterday, that's probably happened. So how do I handle that? Well, I just puff up, get mad, and quit. If they're going to treat me that way, forget it. Or I'm going to go talk about this person to everybody that'll listen. No. That's what people do, but that's not what they're supposed to do. So what am I supposed to do if somebody sins against me? There's a protocol for that. And it's right here. Do what the Bible says. So put a Roman number 1 beside go. Go. Somebody sins against you. I'm not talking about something that you're going to get over. That's not that bad. I just, sometimes somebody will not speak to me, or maybe they'll cut me a little short or something, and I'll say, I bet they're having a bad day. Have I ever had a bad day and done that to somebody else? Yeah. So I don't wear my heart on my sleeve and get upset about the least little thing. But I'm talking about if they do something that really does offend me and I know I'm not going to be able to get over this. They're wrong in this and they need to repent of it. See, the souls are involved. So 1, go. 2, tell him. That's the Roman number 2, tell him. 3, gained thy brother. If he hear thee, you've gained your brother. That's the result. It's over with, in other words. You go, you tell him, he listens, there's penitence. Then you're back to square one. That's the goal of it. You're back to, and you probably even be better friends than you were before, because now you got more of a basis for relationship. Now we've got some history. Now, that my brother loved me enough to talk to me, or in the other case, you say, my brother loved me enough to listen to me. Both of those are relationship builders. Now, if he won't hear you, there's also a protocol for that. So I changed numbers. I used Arabic numbers instead of Roman numbers here, like regular 1, 2, 3. So regular 1 with a circle around it, alone. First, you go alone. He offended you, you go talk to him, one-on-one. You don't bring anybody, you talk to other people, you just go talk to him. Because the goal is that you want to keep this as contained as possible. If just 2 people know about it and you can fix it, well, that's the best scenario. You don't need 3 people or the whole church to know about it. Just 2 people. You fixed it, and then it goes away. Not very much disturbance in the flock about it. But if he doesn't listen, you reason with him, you have the right attitude, you do what the Bible says, but he's stiff-necked. He's not listening. He's making excuses. Okay, so now we got a bigger problem. So, number 2 with the circle around it is in verse 16. Beside 2 or 3 witnesses. For instance, it might be that you go to your brother one-on-one who doesn't listen, so you go back with a couple of the elders of the church. And they come in and you explain the situation. You got witnesses. You got mediators. And hopefully that'll solve it. It's like, it's not just personal now. These are elders, that they're watching for my soul. They don't have a dog in this fight, to use an Alabama phrase. In other words, they're not emotionally invested. They're just objective. But if they won't listen, it doesn't have to be elders. I'm not saying that. I'm just using that as an illustration. It doesn't say elders, but that would make the most sense in most congregations. But it might be 2 or 3 mutual friends between you, something like that. Number 3 is the church in verse 17. And remember earlier I said he was going to say, tell it to the church, and there is no church? Well, here it is. There is no church, but he's talking about when there is a church, and this happens, the third step would be tell it to the church. That would be the withdrawal of fellowship stage. Would come after that. You tell it to the church, and then all the church tries to win him back, or her back. We need to get this fixed. This has gotten, this is pretty serious. So he's got, not a few people, but a lot of people. And then, of course, if that doesn't work, then you would have to exercise discipline. But hopefully, one of those 3 would work. All right. I have written, verse 26, put quotation mark around, Lord, have patience with me. That's a good prayer to pray. That's a good sermon to preach. Lord, have patience with me. That's toward the end of verse 26. I have underlined in verse 27, moved with compassion. Moved with compassion. And then connected that with a line, an arrow actually, to the last verse of the chapter, the phrase that says, from your hearts, from your hearts. Those are the same idea in different words. So he says that the Lord of that servant was moved with compassion. That's the illustration, that's the parable. But when he gets down to the application, he takes that part of the parable and makes it the application. Read verse 35. So likewise shall my heavenly Father do also unto you, if ye, now here's the part underlined, from your hearts forgive. That's the same as move with compassion in verse 27. That's what he's trying to get us to see, is that this man in his story was sympathetic to the man who couldn't pay back, so he forgave him. And now he's saying, what I want you to do is to be sympathetic toward the guy who sins against you, and you forgive him. That's the same idea. Now, the only other note in chapter 18 is verse 32. I've written possibility of apostasy beside that verse. Because then, this is the parable that Jesus gave. It's not his primary point. But he says there was a king who found a servant who owed him a lot of money, and when he went to collect it, he didn't have to pay, so he said, sell him and his wife and his kids and everything he has and pay back as much as you can. And then the man said, he begs him, don't do this, I'll pay you back. And so the king is moved with compassion. He says, I'll forgive you the debt. And so that guy who just got forgiven, he went out and found a guy that owed him $15, 100 pence, not much. And he took him by the throat and he said, pay me what you owe. And the guy said the same thing he had just said to the king. I don't have it. I'll pay you back. Be patient. Long time. He wouldn't. He hauled him down and threw him in jail. And then people who knew about that situation, they went back and told the king, you know that guy you forgave, that great dad? Yeah, he just threw somebody in jail for $15. That made the king mad. They said, go get him. And they arrested him and put him in jail this time. So what's the point? It's about forgiveness, but the point is that guy represents a Christian. The Christian who sinned and needed forgiveness, and God said, I'll forgive you. So the person has become one of God's. And then that one who had been forgiven of offending God so much, one of his fellow servants, another Christian, offends him of a lot less than he offended God about. And he wouldn't forgive him. And then God said, oh yeah? You're not forgiven anymore either. That's pretty serious teaching. And I'm not sure that most Christians give as much thought as it deserves. Because if I'm unwilling to forgive, then God will not, He will rescind my forgiveness. That's what possibility of apostasy means. That's why I wrote it beside verse 32. That's one lesson to learn from that. Okay, let's move on then to chapter 19. What we're doing here is making a transition from the Galilean ministry to the Judean ministry. So we've just completed the first half of the book as far as ministry is concerned. Remember we said from 412 to 1835, that's the Galilean ministry. Well, we just completed that. So now we're moving down into the Judea ministry that begins 19:1 and goes to the end of the book, 28:20. So if you were here on Thursday night, you probably marked verse 19, chapter 19, verse 1, where it says, He departed from Galilee. So underline that, because that's the end of the Galilean ministry right there. He left Galilee. And then underline into the coast of Judea. That's the beginning of the Judean ministry. Of course, Galilee is where he was well received. Judea, he's not going to be well received. In fact, I'm not sure there are any conversions in Judea. I'm not saying there aren't. I'm just not sure there are. I think we'll watch for that. But we're going to find that they were not receptive in Judea like they had been in Galilee. Now, this section also begins the presentation to Israel section. I know I've said this, but I think repetition is helpful, especially on overview stuff. So let me go through this again really quick. Because if you can understand the structure of the book, it's easier to put the pieces in. If you don't have the structure, it's harder to get the smaller messages. So 4 chapters introduction, we've talked about that. Then chapters 4:12 through 18, that's the Galilean ministry. And we emphasize 3 different ideas as subsections of that. What Jesus taught, Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7. What Jesus wrought, that is His miracles, chapters 8 through 10. What the people thought, that's chapters 11 through 18. We just finished that. So just 3 ideas to take out of that whole section. Now we're moving into the Judean ministry. There also are 3 ideas here. There is presentation to Israel. That's 19 to 25. Then there is crucifixion, 26 and 27. And then there's resurrection, 28. So just ideas. Presentation, crucifixion, resurrection. So most of this section, the Judean ministry, has to do with this presentation to Israel. He's going, for instance, we're going to see the triumphant entry into Jerusalem, where he comes in on the colt of an ass or a donkey. All the people are saying, Hosanna to the highest and all that. So he's being presented as Israel's king, and they're going to reject him. But the people are going to receive him, but the leaders are going to reject him. So that's the section where we are, Judean ministry. Now we are, that's the 5,000 feet view, but let's move down to the 1,000-foot view, which is chapter by chapter. So we're going to call this chapter Question on Divorce. Question on Divorce. There are several things in this chapter, but none that you're going to use more, probably, and none you'll hear preached more often on than, well, depending on where you are. Sometimes this is never preached, and other times it's preached, needs to be preached because of our culture. Well, let's go through this section. It's interesting that marriage, divorce, or remarriage is not a modern issue. It's an ancient issue. It goes all the way back to Israel, you know. So this has always been a challenge to God's people and for people in general to please God when it comes to marriages and remarriages. So let's go into this section. We'll go ahead and mark these two ideas, and then we'll discuss it a little more. But 19:9 is your key verse. So circle the number, Matthew 19:9. I'm going to reserve reading it until we get there. But that's going to be our key verse. And then our key lesson is unrelated to divorce. It's another part of the chapter. Never stand between a child and Jesus. That's 19:14. Let's read 19:14. But Jesus said, this is when the disciples, so the parents, you imagine if you had a small child or any age child and Jesus came to your village, Wouldn't you want to introduce Jesus to your child or your child to Jesus? Of course you'd want, come on, we're going to go meet Jesus. So the parents are lining up. You know, Jesus is in town. And the disciples are like, you don't have time for a bunch of kids. What are you doing here? They're running interference for Jesus. He doesn't need them to run interference for him. In fact, he doesn't want them to. And that's the context of 13 and 14. 13, and they were brought unto him little children. They should put his hands on them and pray. Wouldn't you want Jesus to put his hands on your child and pray? Well, that'd be worth something, wouldn't it? And the disciples rebuked him. Get out of here. He doesn't have time for a bunch of kids. But Jesus, in verse 14, said, suffer little children. The word suffer in King James means allow, permit. Permit the little children to come to me. I got time for them. That's okay. Suffer little children and forbid them not. Don't you send them home before I get to lay hands on them and pray. Don't you do that. For of such is the kingdom of heaven. Put a box around kingdom there. Well, what's the lesson we take from that? You know, tomorrow morning, what time is Bible class here tomorrow? 9, 10, 10. 10 o'clock in the morning. All around this building are houses. And there are children at their ages that would love to be in Bible class. They'd love to be studying about Jesus, coloring the pictures, making the crafts, whatever they do. And some of them, no doubt, even ask, who've been to church before, can we go to church tomorrow? Or can we go to church this morning? And the parents say, no, I'm going to sleep in tomorrow. I'm going to sleep in. Or I say, well, no, my buddies and I are going to play basketball tomorrow. Or, no, I got to go to Walmart. Got some stuff to errands to run tomorrow. Here's a child that wants to know about Jesus, wants to come into Jesus' presence. And parents are standing between them and the Lord. That's not a position you want to be in. You can expand that with a lot of different applications. Publishers, movie makers, governments, communities, organizations. There's a whole lot of people that are teaching things to children that ought not be taught to children. And they're standing between them and Jesus. But don't do that. Make sure that we are always helping children get to Jesus. I do a seminar and enjoy doing on church growth. So spend a weekend, usually Friday, Saturday, Sunday, talking about how the church can grow. One of those lessons is on this church would be better if you're trying to set your goals. So the audience is asked, this church would be better if ... How would you answer that? And then I'll throw out some ideas. You answered whatever you think. I don't know what you'd say, but I can tell you some things people say. This church would be better if we had a really good song leader. You know, some small churches, they say, well, we don't really have good singing. I hate to bring my friends over because the singing's not good. Well, that's no reason not to bring your friend. You bring your friend anyway. But, okay, that's one. So how can I fix that? Well, maybe that's a young man in a teenage youth group. I remember, this is not about me. Don't take me out of it. It'd be true of any parent. But I don't lead singing. You know, the only time I've ever been asked to lead singing at one time when I went to a nursing home for singing and no other man showed up. So I had to lead the singing. You know, that's okay. You know, I like to preach. Somebody else leads the singing. Well, so my sons didn't get it from me. You know, one of my sons is a song leader. He's a good song leader. And I saw him get up one night in the singing service at church, like every fourth or fifth Sunday, I don't remember, the singing night. He got up and he's up there with his hands going, you know, beating it. Well, I can't even do it, you know. I said, how did he learn that? And so when I got home that night, I said, Daniel, where did you learn to beat the tune? I don't even know what to call it. And he said, YouTube. You know, he taught himself. You know, he got on there. Didn't have a dad that knew it, so he got on there and watched it. And so what am I saying? I'm saying maybe there's a young man that says, well, the singing's not really that good. So teach yourself how to do it. Go to a singing school. Go to another congregation, find somebody that's a really good song leader and say, would you show me how to do it? And I'll tell you 100 out of 100 times they'll say yes. Because people love to teach you what they know, especially song leaders. They would. Well, so this church would be better if song leaders. Okay, here's another one. This is the whole reason I said this. This church would be better if we had more young people. Is that true in any churches? Yeah. I don't know about the ones represented here. It's not really about us, but it's just the illustration. This church would be better if we had more young people. Okay. Well, what could you do about that? Let me tell you what you could do about it. You could ask God about it first. You think God wants His church to grow? You think He wants young people in His church? You think He'd listen to a prayer about you praying about young people in His church? I believe He would. So why don't we pray about it? But number two, are there any young people within your sphere that you could get to come? Okay, I'll make it more practical. Do you have any kids to bring? Well, all my kids are grown. Do you have any grandkids within driving distance whose parents are not taking them? You know, no doubt your heart's broken about that if that's the case, but if it is, would they let you come and get them? You say, well, I have to get up so early. I know. So? Are the souls of your grandkids not worth getting up at 3 in the morning if you have to do that to bring them? You say, well, I don't know if I got enough energy. They're so energetic. And we're talking about your grandchildren's souls. God will give you the strength to do what you got to do. Well, I have to take them out to lunch and it'll be expensive. I'll loan you some money if that's the problem. Or anybody else would, you know? It's not about, or make sandwiches and go for a picnic somewhere. You can do that. What am I saying? Okay, but you say, well, I don't have any grandkids. Okay. Do you have any neighbors' kids? Do you have any co-workers' kids? I'll tell you a couple stories. Just shouldn't do this, but my roommate in college, his parents are still not Christians. He's a gospel preacher now. Cut to the end of the story, but his parents are, unless they've been converted, I haven't seen him in a little while, but they're not Christians. But he was out in the yard one day playing when he was about 10 maybe, and Sister Johnson lived across the street. And she saw him out there, and she went out and she said, Brad? And he walked over. Would you like to go to Vacation Bible School tonight? Oh, yeah. Well, go ask your mom. So he went in and she said, I can go. So she took him VBS every night. Then the next VBS, she took him. And then at some point, he maybe, 2 or 3 years later, he sort of lost interest. He's a teenager, he's maybe had a job, I don't know, but he quit going. But then when he was 16, for some reason he became interested in church. He decided he needed it. And he thought, he didn't have any connection to any church, he had never been. His parents didn't take it. So he thought, I think I'm going to go to Sister Johnson's church today. Long story short, he went. Of course, they received him, that word we saw earlier. He was baptized. Went to Backwoods Christian Camp. That's where I met him. And he started doing devotionals. And then we went to Faulkner University. He's my roommate. We're both Bible majors. He's preaching the gospel in Florence, Alabama now. Why? Sister Johnson said, do you want to go to VBS with me tonight? You see, God can make a way. I got more stories than that, but I'm not going to love to tell about others that were that's how. It's not isolated. There's a lot of times that happens. So, all right, so don't stand in the way of a child. Instead, help a child make it. That's my point. Okay. Let's see if there's a lot of Bible marks in this one. So I got 2 minutes, 2 to 4 minutes before we do our break. So let me see what I can mark with you. So put a circle around Pharisees in verse 3. Pharisees in verse 3. Then little children in verse 13. Little children. And then in 16, one came. This guy came with a question. but there's another person here. So that's what we're doing, is looking at the different sections. So the Pharisees came, the little child came, or the parents brought the children, then this one came with a question, and then verse 23, disciples. That's the next group. So you have these, and then the last one is Peter in verse 27. So disciples in verse 23, and Peter in verse 27. So you have those 5 groups, sections to the chapter. Jesus is dealing with different people all the way through the chapter. All right, tell you what, we're going to come back. We're going to talk about Jesus' 4 reasons not to get a divorce from this context, and let you mark those in your Bible. But we'll take a break. We'll come back. It's 11 minutes till the hour, so we'll come back at the hour. 26, 27 is crucifixion. And then 28 is resurrection. Resurrection. And I do have that outline for everybody written in the front of Matthew, so if you want to just take a picture of it or copy it out of my Bible, you can do that too. To me, that's helpful because I don't always remember that, but whenever I read Matthew, I review it, and then it helps me as I go through the chapters to sort of know the context when I'm making a transition, that kind of thing. All right, let's go back to Matthew 19. I already flipped the board, so it's not on this board anymore, but everything that I had written on the board we covered. But now I want to do some additional things in Matthew 19. I mentioned as we close that we would notice God's 4 reasons not to get a divorce. So we'll do that first. Now, I will also say, and I guess nowadays you pretty much have to say this, that it takes 2 people to keep a marriage together, you know. So, but this is God's will in a marriage, is for it to stay together. For better, one old preacher used to say, for better or for worse, till they take you away in the big black hearse. You know, that's how long marriage is supposed to last. And some of you in here have been married more than a couple of years, I know. So you've shown a good example to the younger folks about that. But let's mark these. Jesus was asked a question, verse 3. The Pharisees also came to him, tempting him, saying unto him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? We would say, is it permissible to get a divorce for any reason? Same question, just ask a different way. Now, verse 4, Jesus answers it. Now, just like today, there were 2 schools of thought back then in the Old Testament. What we would call today a liberal view and a conservative view. Now, that's not anything new. You had the school of Shammai, or Shema, S-H-A-M-M-U-A, that we would call conservative. And what they're asking, it relates to Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24 is the chapter of the Old Testament that deals with divorce. And so Shammua said the unclean thing that the husband has found in his wife is only fornication. There's another teacher, Hillel, and Shammua was probably still alive at this point or had recently died. But Hillel had been dead for probably 40 years by this point. But his teachings were more popular than the conservative view. Surprise, surprise, right? So the liberal view was more popular than the conservative view. But the liberal view was the unclean thing in Deuteronomy 24 that a man could put away his wife for was anything. Even to the point of she burns your bread. She disappoints you in some way. You know, just about anything. Well, which way would Jesus go? They knew that they're trying to get him involved in 3 different controversies. They're trying to get him in a controversy with Moses first because this is a conservative culture. So if they can get him to look bad in the people's eyes like he doesn't respect Moses, they think that's a good thing. His popularity will plummet. They're also, because he's in Perea when he says this, guess who is the tetrarch of Perea? Herod. What did Herod do to John? Why? What subject was it? You think this is a strategically asked? Yeah. So they're trying to get him in controversy with Herod, and maybe the same thing will happen to him that happened to John. They said it worked one time, maybe it'll work again. And then they're trying to get him into a controversy with the people, because either way he goes on this, some people are not going to like it. You know, the people that take the other view will, I like Jesus, but I'm not so sure about him anymore because he took that other view, you know. So, but Jesus is not going to compromise or hem or haw or beat around the bush about it. He's going to say what he believes, and he's going to take a stand, even though there may be some that would not approve of that. So now we read his answer, verse 4. And he answered and said, have ye not read? I put quotation marks around that. That's a good question. Have you not read? You know, most all the questions that we have, that people ask us, let's just give them a Bible verse. You know, have you read that in your Bible? It's not what I say, not what my church believes, but what does the Bible say? That, you know, it's hard to argue with the Bible. You can argue with me, but the Bible says, read it in your Bible. So have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? Roman number 1, beside that verse, write the word precedent. Precedent, like a court precedent. How do we spell precedent? I'm not a good speller, but. So, Precedent, right, so far? Precedent. Wait, E-N-T? E-N-T. All right, precedent. So there you go. That's verse 4. What's a precedent? Okay, so your court, you have a court case, and it comes up, and the lawyer, the judge, combination thereof, says, you know, we don't need to try this case because this exact trial has already taken place and we have a precedent. That is, we already know what the law says, so we'll just appeal to the precedent. We don't need to do it again. There's already a precedent. So the same thing is true here. Jesus said, there's a precedent for this. There's no new law. We just go back to the one that we already have. And the precedent was not cultural. It was not, let me tell you what the majority of the people believe. Now that wasn't, he didn't appeal to the people. He did not appeal to the prophets even. He didn't even appeal to Moses. He went back before the prophets, before Moses. He went all the way back to the patriarchal age. And then he went all the way back to the very beginning of the patriarchal age. He went to the first day of marriage in the history of the world. The day that Adam and Eve got married, and the words that were said on that occasion. Have you not read Genesis in your Bible? And then he quotes them, the part of Genesis that applies, that he which made them at the beginning, so this is from God, the Creator, made them male and female. So there's your precedent. Don't get divorced because God set it up the way He wanted it to be set up, and that is for two people to marry and stay married, not for two people to marry for a while and divorce. That's the precedent. And as far as we know, we don't know which one died first, Adam or Eve, because we don't know when Eve died. But we know in Genesis 5 that Adam lived to be 930 years old. Most of the time, the wife outlives the husband, so let's assume that in this case. Who was standing beside that grave when they buried Adam? Eve. You think you've put up with your husband a long time. 9 centuries? Can you imagine that? Over 9 centuries? Well, God married them and they stayed married. That's my point. There's no divorce between year 1 and year 930. Genesis 1 all the way to Genesis 5, they stayed together. So that's the precedent. A second reason to keep the marriage together is found in the latter part of verse 5. Made them male and female, so for this cause shall a man leave father and mother and cleave. So the second one is command. Roman number 2, command. A divorce is the opposite of cleave, isn't it? Cleave means, the word here literally means to glue. Cleave. So a divorce is the opposite of that. It's breaking apart what God said to keep together. It's a division of a cleave instead of a cleaving. So it violates the command of God to cleave to your mate. Leave father and mother, cleave. Not the other way around. Not leave your mate and go back to your mother and daddy. Now you leave your mother and daddy and go to your mate and you stay with them. You don't go back and forth. This is a lifetime decision. So that's number 2. Number 3 is design. The design of marriage. That's the latter part of verse 5, where it says, they two shall become one flesh. Now that does refer to the physical act of marriage, but that only illustrates the whole relationship, which is two people merging into one. That is, they join together in having children and rearing them. They join together in serving God. They join together in financial matters. They join together in paying for the, everything. You just got same hopes, aspirations, goals. You go through the same struggles together. Two people become one unit. That's the idea. Now, I'm not a really good woodworker, but when I was younger, my dad was a good woodworker, and I helped him. And I remember sometimes I'd make stuff like in shop or something like. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I remember gluing together two 2x4s. You ever done that? Two 2x4s. Wood glue. Put them together, let it get dry. Well, I don't remember the purpose of it, but whatever the purpose was, it was finished. So I decided I needed to use those 2x4s for something else, but I didn't need them glued together. I just needed one. So I got a crowbar. Started trying to break them apart. You know what happened? Well, I got them apart eventually. But they weren't the same. One 2x4 was not whole, and the other one was more than whole. You know, part of this 2x4, when it split apart, was still stuck to this one. You see? It split along the wood grain, in other words. The glue was stronger than the wood grain. So the two wouldn't break apart evenly. Do you see what I'm saying here? So you have two people who marry and they grow together. Then you break them apart. You don't have the two same single people that, 15 years ago were glued together. That's why it hurts so bad. Because it's grown together. And now the split is not even. It's not easy. So God said two become one. The design of marriage is against divorce. It makes it so painful. And then the fourth reason in the same text is the will of God. That's in verse 6. I circled the word God and then drew a line between God and man. They're categorized in my Bible, God and man. Whose will are we looking to please? And then write will, W-I-L-L, beside it. Marriage counselors may hear something like this. Well, I am not happy in this marriage anymore. He treats me bad. I am, I, me, my. Where's the focus? Self. What about if somebody went in and said, what does God want me to do? Well, you don't have to wonder. God doesn't have to whisper in your ear to tell you what He thinks. He already said what He wanted. He put it in the book. It's my will that you stay together. Let not what God joined asunder, not other way around. Let not what God put together, you put asunder. So God's will is for it to stay together. So there's 4 reasons there. And that's good for our personal life, but also good for teaching others, encouraging others. Well, there's a lot more on this. I'd like to go into the meaning of all the words and all, but I'm not going to do that. But what I am going to do before we leave this is I was asked to speak Wednesday night, before I came over here, on the subject, can I change my gender? I've never preached on that before. You ever preached on that? I don't know. I'll probably mention it before. So, what was interesting, this is in Florence, Alabama, and the preacher there, I've known him a while, and he said, he was pointing to the audience from the back. He said, this is a good crowd. This is a big crowd. It wasn't about the speaker, but it was about the subject. Because one of the youth ministers in the area brought his youth group over, a whole group, to hear it. And there were the people we had supper with said, yeah, a couple of my friends from another church. There's a lot of churches in Florence. Said, well, what time's that service about? Why? Well, this is a subject people are having to deal with, right? So if you were asked to speak on that or answer that question, can I change my gender? What would you do? Well, I wondered what I'd done to him to get stuck with that subject. And he actually said when he introduced at the beginning of the service, he said all the other speakers in the summer series, we let them pick their topic, but we didn't let Alan pick his topic. He said we assigned this one, which I told him I was glad. I never studied this, so I was glad to research it. But anyway, long story short, these are the 3 points from that lesson. And they relate here. The reason I'm bringing it up is because it's the same passage. It started in the same place as Jesus did here in Matthew 19. So, number 1, changing my gender. Tell you what, I did this. Some of you have taken pictures of the pages of the chapters. I brought that sermon in with me too, so you can take pictures of that after this over if you want it. the gender sermon. So it kind of changed my gender. Number one, it disregards God's precedent, which is what we just noticed. Because what did God do? He made a man, and what did He make? A woman, right? What other genders did He make? You know, Facebook has 71 gender choices now. Can you believe that? 71. I mean, I didn't go look. I wondered what in the world could they be. Could you choose to be a Cocker Spaniel or something? I don't know what kind of choices would there be. Well, God said, and God didn't say, Adam, are you happy being a man? Would you rather be a woman? And He didn't say Eve after He made her to be a helpmeet, a suitable helper for Adam. He didn't say, now Eve, I made you a woman, but I didn't ask you. Is that okay? No. God made what God wanted made. He set the precedent, and He's God. He owns us because He made us. He also owns us because He bought us with His Son's blood. So that's number one. God set it up the way He wanted it set up. And for man to change that precedent is to go against God's will. Gender is biological, not a social construct. What does that mean? It means DNA. What's that? That's genetic. It means X and Y chromosomes. What's that? That's biological, or XX chromosomes. Incidentally, you could theoretically make a woman out of a man because man has an X and a Y chromosome, right? But you could never do it the other way around because women only have X chromosomes. So you could never make a man out of a woman. Isn't that interesting? You could never make a man out of a woman, and God made a woman out of a man one time, which is Eve. It's biological. Here's the 4 subpoints of that. It's anatomical, not an identity choice. Anatomical. Now, I know that people are making distinctions between sex and gender. In other words, the anatomy and the choice. But sex and gender are identical. There's no dichotomy between the one and the other. The anatomy is the gender. And I know that there are birth defects. Very rare, 5 out of 10,000 births. You pick any part of the human body and you're going to have a birth defect, a percentage that have a defect in that area. So you have anatomical defects of the sexual organs in a very small percentage. But there's still a gender assigned. You take the DNA and it will say X or XY. It will show you the gender. Well, I can't preach this whole sermon. That takes a whole hour. So let me just give you the 3 main points. Number 2. So it's disregards God's precedent. Number 2, it rejects God's authority. It rejects God's authority. Somebody turn over, read from Isaiah 29:16. You can put in your notes Isaiah 64:8, which also talks about the potter and the clay. But this one, 29:16, Isaiah 29:16. You don't have to have much imagination to figure out how that verse applies, do you? Shall the thing formed say to the one who formed it, why did you make me thus? King James has. Somebody says, I'm trapped in the wrong body. No, you're not. Nobody can do that. Because how many mistakes has God ever made in the history of the world? How many? 0. You can count them on one hand and you don't need any fingers. God never makes a mistake. That's Numbers 23:19. And since God never makes a mistake and God assigns gender, then gender cannot be wrong because God assigns it. You know, my sister, I'll just give you an illustration. My sister had a baby, it was a boy. My sister had another baby, it was a boy. My sister had a third baby and it was a boy. She really wanted a girl. She wanted a daughter, you know. So, should we have another one or not? You know what? So they had a fourth baby. It was a girl. So she finally got a girl. But they didn't get to choose, did they? That's my point. Parents can't choose gender. You get whatever is assigned, whatever God assigns. No matter how much you may want one or the other, God assigns gender. And to say that my gender is wrong is to say, God, you messed up. And to say that God, you messed up is to say, I don't believe you're God. I don't believe in God at all, because you can't have God and God make mistakes. Now, there are a lot of verses on that. Romans 11:33, the wisdom of God is unsearchable. I got about probably 25 verses on this point. Exodus 5:2, Romans 9:19 and 20, Isaiah 55:8 and 9, Romans 1:20, 32, a lot more, but you can copy that if you want more. Then number 3, to change my gender violates God's commands. Yes, sir. Well, there was Isaiah 29:16 and Isaiah 64:8. Numbers 23:7, might have been Numbers 23:19, which says God never makes a mistake. That's not the wording, but that's what it was. Numbers 23:17. Numbers 23:19. 23:19. Okay. Now this is the part where it gets a little deeper after you start thinking about it. Okay, let's say you've got a biological male that becomes a female. Becomes is the wrong word. You don't change your essence. But you can have a sex surgery, you can have hormones. You're still who God made you to be. But for external purposes, change gender. Okay, so this person grows up. Incidentally, well, I'll come back to that. You can't follow God's commands in that situation. Why? Well, here, let me just give you some examples. God forbids blurring of the lines between male and female. That's exactly what our culture is trying to do, is to blur the lines. Mattel toys, they now have a label-less line of toys, dolls, inclusive, they say. Not boys, not girls, because a lot of boys like to play with dolls. Man. Label-less. Deuteronomy 22:5 forbids a man to wear a woman's garment and a woman to wear a man's garment. It's an abomination to God, that verse says. Abomination to blur the sexes. What about 1 Corinthians 11:3 in the New Testament? A woman cannot have short hair. A man cannot have long hair. Why? Same reason. Make a distinction between the sexes. You can multiply others, but that's enough to show the gist of it. Number 2, what about the roles that God has assigned to gender? There's 4 of them. Now, here is someone born a male, becomes a female, or vice versa. Where do they fit in this? Okay, what about marriage and sex? God has assigned roles for that. Leviticus 18:22-25, God says, thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. In other words, no same-sex relationships. So here's a person that's transitioned into a different gender. Who are they going to marry? Who are they going to have sex with? It really doesn't matter which, it matters because it's sin involved, but either way you go, you can't fulfill the role God gave you. Because you've changed your body, so you can't fulfill what God said to do. And now what kind of person what gender are you going to choose to marry? Either way, you got a problem with marriage and sex roles. And those roles, 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10 of the New Testament also. Then what about home and family? Home and the husband is the head of the wife. So you got people who switch genders. Who's head of who? Who's head of whom? That's 1 Corinthians 11:2, Genesis 3:16. Genesis 3 is where Adam and Eve had sinned, and God came and doled out punishments. And He said to Eve, thy husband or the man shall rule over thee. that was a sign. And man also had his punishments, sweat of the brow and all that. But it goes back to Genesis 3:16. Then you go to 1 Timothy 2. Well, I'll come back to 1 Timothy 2. Ephesians 5:23 through 33 shows the different roles between the husband and the wife. You can't fulfill those in a transgender situation. Number 3, what about society? There are male roles in society, female roles in society. 1 Corinthians 11:2 says, the head of every, let's see, which way does it go? The head of every woman is the man, the head of the man is Christ, the head of Christ is God. So there's a chain of command. Someone says, well, that makes me inferior. No, it doesn't. Because Jesus is not inferior to God. He made that statement explicitly, repeatedly in the gospel accounts, that he was equal to God. But he chose to put himself under the authority of God because that was what God desired. Same thing with male and female. There's no inferiority, there's just different assignment of roles. Then number 4, what about in the church? And this is 1 Timothy 2:11-14, the 4 different roles: marriage and sex, home and family, society, and the 4th is in the church. So how does transgenderism fit into a church setting? It doesn't. Because the women, yes. 1 Timothy 2:11-14. There are gender-specific roles in that text. I'm drawing a blank. Let the women adorn themselves in modest apparel, shamefacedness, sobriety, not broidered hair, costly array, or then let the men lift up holy hands without wrath and doubting. Let the women learn in all silence. So there's a different roles there. And then he even goes on and explains it. Sometimes he doesn't explain why things are, but this time he does. He says, for the man was first formed, then Eve. So you're back to precedent again. Does God do anything by accident? And you'd have to say no. So make the man first or the woman first? Well, he didn't flip a coin. He did what he wanted to do. He made the man first, and there was a reason for it. For the man was first formed. And he's referring to that, 2003, 4, how far back? That's 4,000 years later. He's still referring to it. Now, and then he said, and the woman being deceived. When the serpent came, so there's 2 reasons for the role assignments. One, precedent, and the other is punishment for sin. We saw that in Genesis 3:16. And nonetheless, she shall be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith and sobriety. In other words, she fulfills her role. It doesn't mean you have to have a child. A female has to have a child to be saved. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying, though, she has to fulfill her role, which most of the time includes being a wife and a mother. And she's going to train her children. Most important thing any woman will ever do is train children, because she's focusing the next generation. She's preparing the next generation. So if she does that well, she'll be saved. That's what God said. She still has value, function in society. Let's see. So distinction, don't blur the distinction between the sexes. 2, fulfill the roles. You can't do that with transgender situation. 3, you can't be a parent and fulfill the role of a parent in that situation. Okay. Did you know that there are parents who are giving their 8- and 9-year-old children hormone blockers? 13-year-old girls are having mastectomies and removing part of their bodies because they are, quote, transitioning to male. What 8-year-old should be making decisions, lifetime decisions? What 13-year-old girl needs to have part of her body cut off? Now, I know this would be offensive to many people, but I'm going to say it because I believe it's the truth. That's an awful form of child abuse. That's what that is. That's an awful form of child abuse. For parents to do that to a child that they have the responsibility for is wrong. It's sinful. You can't be a parent in that situation. Now, what about when this person grows up and has children? There are 3 situations. You have the way God set it up: a husband marries a wife, children. Then you have the situation I corrected. It's not good for man to be alone, Genesis 2:18. Now, that's not to say everybody has to marry, but most people will choose to marry. Paul, the apostle, did not marry because he went to carry the gospel. He's in prison all the time. It would have been hard to have a family like that. So he chose not to marry. But generally speaking, single people or alone people, that's a hard life. Then there is same-sex relationships, and that's a parasitic situation. What do you mean by parasitic? God said, and he tied this to gender, by the way. Right after he said male and female made he them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That's only possible in a heterosexual relationship. It's only possible the way God set it up. Now, it's possible in a single situation to sin and create children, but it's never better. It's not good for the children. It's not good for the individual. It's not good financially. Not good for the culture. Not good. It's just not good. But it's possible. But it's not even possible in a same-sex relationship. So for that grouping to have children, it has to be parasitic. In other words, they have to take the heterosexual's children as their own. Adopt. And if you research this much, manipulate, abuse, all those things come up. I could give you some personal examples of that from being a minister about that. Anyway, so parenting. So you can't be the parent because you can't produce the offspring. And since God said that homosexuality is a learned behavior, not a genetic one, Romans 1 says that. It's against nature. God said it's against nature. That's 18 to 20, really through 32. It's against nature. So it's not normal. It's not something God made. So since God didn't make it, then He never makes it. He didn't make it in the beginning, and He hasn't made it in any generation since. So that means that in one generation, if it were not taught, if there were not children brought up in that environment to reproduce it, that mindset of same sex, it would die out in one generation. It would have to die out because it cannot produce itself. So it's parasitic. Well, then I'll end on a positive note on that. We're not at the end of our class yet, but there is one time when gender doesn't matter. You know when that is? When the invitation is offered. Galatians 3:28. There's neither male nor female. So what does that mean? That means it doesn't mean we have different roles in the church. It doesn't mean that one verse cancels out everything else about gender or roles in the Scriptures. It doesn't. That's not why God didn't write that one verse to cancel out everything else that we've already said. What it does mean, though, is whenever the preacher is standing up here and he extends the Lord's invitation, and there's a man that steps out on this side and he walks down the front and he sits on that row right there, and then there's a woman that steps out on this side and she sits on the... Which one is God more pleased has responded? Neither one. Neither one. He loves the woman, He loves the man, He loves them equally. He wants them both to be in His kingdom. There's neither male nor female when it comes to that. Salvation is genderless. Everybody. God wants everybody. All right, well, I meant to take a little bit of time there because I feel like sometimes you need to do that, to apply the Scriptures. But now we've got to pick up the pace. So let's go back into this. There's a whole lot more on this page, anybody who wants it, about the definitions of the words and stuff like that. But I'm not going to go into it. Okay, let's go down to, I said that we would read verse 9. So after Jesus says what He said and answers the question, they follow up with a second question in verse 7. Why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement to put her away? That's Deuteronomy 24:1. Jesus saith, Moses, because of the hardness of your heart, suffered you. He made an exception to the law that was not God's original plan. He made this concession not to encourage divorce. That's not the point, Jesus said. Put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. See, Jesus said, Moses did make that exception, but we're going back in my kingdom to the very beginning the way God set it up. That's the way it's going to be. Now verse 9, and I say unto you, what's that next word? Whosoever. So this only applies to Christians, right? Whosoever. That's the same word that's used in salvation passages. Whosoever will, let him come. Is that only for Christians, right? No, that's everybody. John 3, when he's talking about the new birth. Whosoever. Acts 2:21, whosoever. Whosoever means whosoever. You know, we got a song that says that. That's right, because it comes out of the Scriptures. Well, whosoever, so that's an important word. Sometimes the answer to men's quibbles is right in the verse. Just read the verse again, you know. And there it is. Shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication. One permissible reason for divorce. If one of the spouses is sexually unfaithful to the other spouse, then the one who was not sexually unfaithful can break that relationship and be married to someone else with God's approval. The person who was guilty of the fornication, the adultery, cannot be. They've broken the covenant. But the innocent person can be joined into another relationship. Except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. Committeth adultery. So even committeth there is the ETH ending in the King James. A lot of people don't like the King James anymore because it is some of it is a little bit more difficult to understand. But there are some good things about it. And one is the different verb tenses. Like this is a continuing situation. If you just have, you can go look it up no matter what version you use. I'm not saying that. But if it says commits adultery, well, that could mean one time or it could mean continue. ETH means it continues, and it's in the word. And that's what the verb here that's translated means. It means every time they go to bed together, they're committing adultery. It's not just the night they sleep together the first time after they're married. No, it's every time. It committeth adultery. It's an ongoing lifestyle. And whosoever marrieth her, which is put away, doth commit adultery. So God drew the line at the sex act, that someone might do wrong, that didn't lead all the way to that. You can't divorce because a man looked at it lustfully at a woman. Now, that's wrong, but that's not what God said you could divorce for. She might have flirted with her boss, and they might have gone pretty far in a relationship, but if they didn't sleep together, that's where God draws the line. John 8:4, this woman's caught in the act of adultery. That's where God draws the line, at the act of adultery. Now, next time the disciples ask a question, well, if that's the case, you're going to be that strict, Jesus, then it wouldn't be good to get married at all. That's verse 10. But he said to them, all men cannot receive the saying save them to whom it is given. He's not saying that you get to pick or choose whether you obey this or not. That's not what that verse means. But it means some people won't accept it. And I've talked to people like that. You may have too. There's a people that won't accept a lot of things in the Bible, especially if it deals directly with them. And Jesus says some people won't accept it. It doesn't mean it's not true. It doesn't mean we won't judge them, but they won't accept it. Then verse 12, there are some eunuchs. A eunuch is someone who doesn't have the ability to have the sex act, to be married in that way. So there's some eunuchs that are so born from their mother's womb. We talked about the birth defects. Well, that's what this is talking about. And there are some eunuchs which are made eunuchs of men. For instance, male servants who worked in the palace around the king, almost always circumcised, made eunuchs. Why? No temptation for the queen and no raping the queen because they've been made eunuchs. Now, the third one, and there are be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. That is, they've chosen not to marry because what Jesus said. So there's a situation where they don't have the right to marry, so they don't marry. And I don't have any idea and don't want to know about in this congregation, but I know in the congregation where I preached for a long time, we had that situation. And I had great respect for, I'm just thinking of one now, I think there were more than one, but for this lady. She was a very sincere person. She didn't have the right to remarry, and she was faithful to God, even though she was in this situation. And you think about go to heaven forever. How long is that compared to I'm going to live alone for, the rest of my life? Well, by comparison, which one's which? Which one, is it worth it? And the answer would be, that lesson we had a little while ago about whatever it is that keeps you out of heaven, get rid of it. Well, that would apply here. All right. Let's go down to 28. I need to explain a little bit in 28. This is when Peter asked the question, "Behold, we have forsaken all and followed thee. What shall we have therefore?" Now, I really think it's interesting that Jesus does not criticize Peter here. He doesn't say, "Peter, it's not about reward. You should want to do it just because it's right," or anything like that. No, Jesus holds that up as a legitimate reason to be a Christian because of the rewards that are involved in it. So he doesn't say we shouldn't think about heaven or we shouldn't think about this great reward. He in fact says we should think about it, and we've made a wise choice if that's what we choose to use our lives for, because it's a great payment. It's a great reward. So, anyway, verily I say to you that ye which have followed me in the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit in the throne of his glory, ye also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging 12 tribes of Israel. These apostles will be in special positions, of course. So that regeneration refers to the Christian age or to the church. Right now, this is the regeneration. And the verse that shows that is Acts 3:19. Acts 3:19. Now, a premillennialist will take that and run with it, but all he's saying is that the church age is not yet started, or the Christianity is not yet started, because he hasn't died to purchase the church. But when it starts, then there will be, the apostles will judge in what sense? Maybe just through their writings, maybe just, I don't know what all will be involved with the apostles being sitting on 12 thrones, but we can trust it and find out later what it actually means. Okay. Matthew chapter 20. I'm not going to spend as long on these chapters, but I didn't intend to. I really wanted to cover 19 in a little more detail. So we'll see. We've got 5 minutes to the break, and then we got the one more session. So we'll see if we can get all this. Hopefully, I'd like to finish this board today, and then tomorrow we'll do the last, the chapters 26 through 28. But if not, we'll just finish the rest of it in the Bible class tomorrow or in the afternoon. Matthew 20, latecomers accepted. That's what we're going to call this chapter, latecomers accepted. This is the chapter where Jesus tells the parable about the farmer who went to hire laborers, and he went early in the morning, he found some guys, and he said, "Would you work for me?" And they said, "Yeah." And they agreed, "Well, how much are you going to pay?" "We're going to pay you a penny." "Okay, that's good. Pay me a penny." So they went to work, and they knew at the end of the day, they're day laborers, they get paid a penny. Now, to us, that doesn't sound like much money, right? So a penny. I wouldn't work all day for a penny. No, we wouldn't, but it's according to how much that penny would buy, right? So in that economy, a penny was a day laborer's wage. It worked out. So he went out later in the day, and he hired some more workers. And we got to get this crop in. Maybe it was about to rain, or maybe they didn't have but a short, I don't know. But anyway, he kept hiring workers all day. We got to get this crop in. And he went out even at 1 hour before dark, and he found some more workers. "Would you go work in my field? And whatever's right, I'll pay you." And so they said, "Yeah, we'll go work." So they went and worked an hour. And then he paid them all. And he started with the ones that were recently hired back, and the last ones to go through the line were the ones that were hired in the morning. And so the ones that had worked for an hour, he paid them a penny. And no doubt they were happy about that. And then the ones that had worked for 3 hours, they got paid a penny, and 6 hours a penny. And then those guys that worked all day, let's say 12 hours, they thought, well, he paid them a penny, we worked more, he's going to pay us more. And then he paid them a penny, and they were grumbling about that. And he says, "Friend, didn't we agree at that number this morning?" "Well, yeah, I said I'd work all day for a penny." "Okay, did you get your penny?" "Yeah." "Well, what are you fussing about?" Now, it's not really about, he said, if I'm a generous person, why do I get criticized for it? In other words, I'm generous to these people that have worked an hour. Well, are you going to criticize me for being good? I'm being good. And I'm not being bad by honoring my agreement with you. So, no criticism deserved. But anyway, it's not really about the money or the economy or the work. What it's about is the Jews' view of the Gentiles. So the Jews had been serving God in their minds all the way back to Moses. 1,500 years, and they walked around like, we're God's people. We're the chosen people. You Gentiles, you're persona non grata. Don't come around me. We're God's people. Of course, we saw that in chapter 3. What did John say about the axe? Well, just before the axe is laid through the trees, in other words, Judaism is going to be cut down. It's about verse 12. But verse 9 says, God can raise up of these stones children unto Abraham. In other words, you think you're so special? God doesn't need you. God could take rocks and make people out of them if you wanted to. So don't be big-headed about it. Well, that's the same thing here. Jesus is saying to these Jews, you think that you've been laboring in the vineyard a long time, therefore you ought to get paid more. But guess what? The Gentiles that are just now being allowed to come in, they're going to get paid the same. Do the Jews have a better heaven than Gentiles have? No, it's the same heaven. We're all going to get to go there if we're faithful, whether we're of Jewish background or Gentile background. And may I ask you this? In that parable, and I know we didn't read it out loud, but you've read it before probably, but were those people that were hired and only worked 1 hour, were they there in the morning and said, no, we don't want to work? No, they weren't. They came the first opportunity they had. So, what about the Gentiles? Well, as soon as the door opened to Gentiles, guess what? To the church, they started coming in. It was their opportunity. Acts chapter 8 for the half-breeds and 10 for Cornelius and full-blooded Gentiles. So they came in as soon as they were invited. And that's the point. Jesus said they got paid a penny. So that's the reason we're calling this chapter Latecomers Accepted. God accepts Gentiles just like He does Jews. Now our key verse is verse 28, so circle the number, Acts 20:28, and I'll read that. 20:28, even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and give His life a ransom for many. That's a very famous verse in the book. 20:28. So minister means to serve. Jesus came not to be served, but He came to serve. Now, let's use as our life lesson verse 26 in the same context. The lowest is the greatest. That's the life lesson from this chapter. The lowest is the greatest. 26 says, but it shall not be so among you. In other words, with the Gentiles, whoever's got the most servants, whoever's the boss, that's what they desire. But it won't be like that in my kingdom. It shall not be so among you, but whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. Let him be the servant. And Jesus illustrated that, John 13, when, all the disciples are sitting there with dirty feet, And Peter's like, I'm not going to wash Bartholomew's feet. No way. And Thaddeus is like, I'm not going to wash John's feet. John can wash my feet. And James is like, not me. So Jesus comes in. What does He do? Lays aside His robe. He girds Himself with a towel. He gets down and He takes the feet of, let's say, James. Starts washing them. Then next one, he gets to Peter. Peter says, you're not going to wash my feet, Lord. He said, if I don't wash you, you don't have any part with me. In other words, you're not one of mine. You got to love this about Peter, He said, well, don't just wash my feet then. Wash my head and my hands, everything. I want to be all in. I love that. He washed all of them. Then he asked the question, do you know what I've done? Well, literally, yeah, you just washed our feet, but that's not the question he's asking. What he's asking is, do you know what I've done? I just set an example for you. You need to remember this forever. That I'm your master, but I washed your stinky feet. I wasn't too good to do it. So now you go out and do likewise. And there are some things that aren't pleasant that we do for other people. I guess washing feet was not pleasant, but He did it. And so the more we're willing to do those kinds of service jobs, the more pleased Jesus and God are with us. That we're lifted up. When we lower ourselves, He lifts us up. So that's the lesson from chapter 20. Let's see if there's anything here. There's a couple of things. So I'll tell you what, we'll take our break and come back, and I'll spend just not long, There's a couple of Roman number 1, 2, 3s I'd like to give you in this chapter. Then we'll go to chapter 21. When we get to chapter 21, we're in the last week of Jesus' life. So we're going to mark Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. We're going to mark those as we go through these chapters. So next time you read it, it's like, oh, this is 8 days before Jesus' resurrection. That's chapter 21. Then we'll go from there. All right, we'll take our break and come back pretty close to 3 o'clock, if you will. So 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. Under 20, 21. Yeah, that should be, you're right. Should be 21. Thank you. All right, let's go to chapter 20 and mark a few things. So in the first verse, circle the two words, hire laborers, because that's the parable about the laborers that I just told you in my own words. Yes, H-I-R-E. I'm from Alabama. That doesn't come out quite right, but H-I-R-E, however you say that word. Laborers, those two words in verse 1. Then the next one is in verse 20, mother of Zebedee's children. She comes with a request to Jesus. She's an ambitious mother. In fact, you might want to write that beside verse 20. She came worshiping him and desiring a certain thing. A favor to ask, what wilt thou? Jesus says 21. She says, grant that these my two sons, James and John. She said, I want my two boys. So she's living through her boys. You know, we do that sometimes, don't we? And may sit the one on the right hand, the other on thy left in thy kingdom. We would say, I want my two boys to be your vice presidents. That'd be okay? Can one be your vice president on your right hand and the other be your vice? She was trying to exalt them above the other disciples. She wants them to be, you know. So Jesus answered, verse 22, you don't know what you're asking for. And besides, I can't give it to you because it's not mine to give. My Father set all that up, and I can't change it. So then he uses as a teaching moment. What's a teaching moment? Teaching moment is when you got everybody's attention and something's happened, and so you've got an opportunity to present, and Jesus does that. That's the context where we read already about the lowest is the greatest in the key verse. Both of those are in the context. In other words, don't be like the Gentiles. Zebedee's wife is saying, I want them to be advanced. Jesus said, don't be like Gentiles. The greatest is the lowest. Don't try to jockey for position. Try to get lower than everybody else. So that's why he gives that at this time. I marked in verse 24, Roman number 1, 2, 3. So when the 10 heard it, so it got back to the others what James and John were trying to do, or their mother was trying to do. And then Roman number 2, they were moved with indignation. They heard about it, they got mad about it. And then number 3, they were against the two brethren. They were against them. So they heard about it, they got mad about it, and then there's a relationship breakdown. Well, that's the way things go, isn't it? First you hear about it, and then sometimes there's no immediate problem, but people go home and think about it. Or other people said, you going to take that off of him? And then they come back and they're mad. So you got that same kind of situation that elders have to deal with sometimes in the church. Then in verse 31, have mercy on us, O Lord. I put quotation marks around that phrase. Verse 31, have mercy on us, O Lord. That's a good prayer. Also put a circle around two blind men in verse 30. Verse 30, two blind men. There's a textual question in verse 29. Let me touch on that. One account says they were leaving Jericho. Jericho. The other account says they were coming into Jericho when the blind men came. So the critics say, see there, your Bible's got mistakes in it. Was he coming or going? Which one was it? Well, there are answers to these things. Don't get swept off your feet if somebody finds something like that, or if you find something like that. So the answer to this one is there were two Jerichos. There was the old one, and then they rebuilt a new one. But the old one was still there. So he was leaving one and coming into the other. Makes sense, doesn't it? So it's not hard to answer. But, and really, the fact that there are differences between the accounts shows there's no collusion. What's collusion? Well, let's say that two people committed a crime and they got they got arrested and the police have them in different rooms, question them at different times. If their stories are exactly the same, what does the police say? Collusion. They worked out this story ahead of time. So there has to be enough difference between witnesses to say that they didn't get the story together, but then all the main points have to line up. So that's what you have. So it's actually not against the Bible, it's a point in the favor of the Bible that there are these differences. Okay, the next one is in verse 32, Roman number 1, 2, 3. Jesus stood still, that's Roman number 1. Then Jesus said, that's Roman number 2, what will ye that I should do unto you? And then Roman number 3 is in verse 34, he had compassion on them. So Jesus took time, he stood still. Number 2, he communicated. Number 3, he blessed. Well, that's a pretty good example for us, isn't it? Take time for people, listen to people, bless people. Right? That's a strong sermon, I think. All right, that's all I'm going to say about chapter 20. Let's move into chapter 21. I'm going to call chapter 21 the Triumphal Entry, because here's where Jesus comes riding into Jerusalem on the colt, the foal of a donkey. Our key verse is 23, so circle the number 23, and I'll read that. And when he was come into the temple, the chief priests and elders of the people came unto him as he was teaching and said, now I put quotation marks and underline this phrase, this question. By what authority doest thou these things? Before this, he cleansed the temple. He really upset a lot of people. So who gave you the authority to come in here and turn over our money tables and let our birds loose and cause all this ruckus? Who gave you this authority? So that's the question. And in his answer, he said, tell you what, I got a question for you, and if you answer my question, I'll answer yours. So he always was a step ahead of them. It's amazing to watch these confrontations, because it's almost like the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. You remember watching that? I mean, you didn't really, it's a new one, you never saw it before, but you knew what was going to happen. The Roadrunner was going to get the best of Wile E. Coyote every time. There's never an exception to that, right? So it's like that with Jesus and the Pharisees. They're never going to get the best of him. You just don't know how he's going to do it yet. And that's what happens here. So he says, well, what about the baptism of John? Was that from heaven or men? That's the right question, by the way, to ask about anything. Is this from heaven or is it from men? If it's from heaven, believe it and do it. If it's of men, don't. So you might want to, I haven't even underlined that in my own Bible yet, but you could do that, the middle part of verse 25, from heaven or of men. I've heard sermons preached on that. That's a good topic. And you just go down and ask, is the mourner's bench from heaven or from men? Is the piano in worship from heaven or from men? Is burning incense from heaven or from men? Is salvation by faith only, that doctrine, is that from heaven or is that from men? Is worshiping Mary from heaven or from men? So you can go down, you can make a long list. You could apply that however it would be helpful to the people. But anyway, we move on and see verse 28. Put circle around 2 sons, because that's what that parable is about. The 2 sons go work in my vineyard. One said no, the other said yes. The one that said no eventually came back and said, I'll go. The one that said he would go never went. Which one was the better son? Well, the one that eventually went was the better son, even though he was rebellious to start with. And that's about the publicans and the Pharisees. Publicans first, well, they were bad, but then they came back and they did what God wanted, and that was good. The Pharisees said, we'll do it, but they never got around to it. So they weren't as good as the publicans. The next thing to put a circle around is in verse 33, vineyard. Just the word vineyard. 33, the word vineyard. And then an underline in verse 45. Underline in verse 45. They perceived that he spake of them. So they're getting more and more angry with him, and he is letting them know, he's letting them see themselves in a different light. When they wrote the narrative, they were the heroes. We're the good guys. Jesus is turning that on his head and saying, you're not the good guys. And he's telling stories. Remember parables? Parables conceal the truth. But even sometimes the enemy's got the point. And that's what happens here. He didn't come right out and say, you know, you're a bad person, you're bad. No, but he told a story and they said, hey, that's about us. What does he mean by that, you know? So that's the section about the vineyard, verse 33. He went into far country and they sent messenger back to the vineyard and they killed some of them, ran them off. And they said, well, what's going to do when he comes back? Well, he's going to miserably deal with that guy. He's going to take away his position. He's going to punish him. Yeah. So God sent prophets to you. And what'd you do to the prophets? You rejected them. You killed some of them. You put some of them in prison. I mean, go back and read what happened to Jeremiah. You know, some of the other prophets. They did awful things to them. Well, who sent those prophets? God did. So is God going to just let that go and not defend his own prophets? Is he not? No, that was coming. AD 70, he was going to come in and wipe out that city, burn the temple, and do away with Judaism forever. So this is a precursor to that. He's telling them what's going to happen in the future. Okay, let's see. If you wanted to say one lesson from 21, let's call it this. Hosanna is our watchword. One thing we need to be emphasizing, my judgment, and you have a different opinion, that'd be okay, but I think that we need to be emphasizing the importance of praise and worship in the church. I like to try not to overstate things, but there are some churches that have just gotten to where they're going through the motions. That's my judgment. Could be wrong. It's just, you know, same old, same old. There's no energy. There's no enthusiasm. Some of that may be because they're beaten down because of COVID and the community and everything. But it's time for us to have excitement in our services. I'm not talking about doing new things. It's doing the same things better that we need to do. We don't need to do new things that aren't in the Scriptures. And some people jazz it up, they turn the lights down, they pop music in, all that. That's artificial. That's not right. It's not authorized. But the 5 things that are authorized, we need to do better with those 5 things. We need to sing with more enthusiasm. We need to sing in the first place. Some people are sitting there listening. That's not worship. Sing. Then we need to pray. The God leading the prayer, He's not the one praying. He's the one leading. Everybody's praying. So say amen if you agree with it. Say amen. Then what about the giving? Well, after I get my boat paid off and my golf membership and I got to pay Christmas off from last year, I don't have much money right now, but I'm going to give a little, I'll give, but hey. You know the only place God will accept on your list? Top, number 1. It's the only place He accepts. You put Him number 2, just keep it. Just keep it. Did you know that He told worshipers that before? Malachi. They're bringing the halt and the blind and He said, you wouldn't give that to your governor, would you? Why are you giving it to me? I don't want it. You keep it. Just keep it. If I don't mean any more to you than that, stay home. Why do you tread my courts? That's Isaiah 1. So I just mixed Isaiah 1 and Malachi 3, but they're the same thing. Well, what are you tracking up my temple for with your muddy shoes or your sinful shoes? Stay home. Unless you're going to do it right. Unless I mean something to you. Unless I mean more to you than your governor does. I think that sermon needs to be preached in just about every church. And you want to know why kids are falling away, leaving the church? Well, somebody says, we didn't have an instrument like the Baptists. That's not why. That's not it. Or, well, you know, the world's so powerful, it's just pulling them. Well, there's no one answer to this, but I'll tell you what one of the answers is. Dead worship services. They see Dad when they're little and they're sitting on the same pew with him, You know? They pass the Lord's Supper. I don't know if you use the cups, any of it, whatever. They see you pass the tray. And the kids can tell he's bored out of his skull. That kid's going to grow up and leave the church. I could predict it. It's not because the preacher didn't have good sermons. It's not because there weren't good elders in that church. It's not because they didn't have a youth minister. You know why he's going to leave? Because his dad was not a good Christian. That's why. We ought to say it like we ought to tell the truth. We've got to tell the truth. And that dad needs to change his life before he loses his kid to hell. This is real. This is serious. People who are playing church are losing their kids and blaming the church for it. It's not church's fault. No, we need to help any way we can. But it's mom and dad's fault. They need to get them to the church. In the church, and they need to be faithful. Now, what about that same dad? He takes the Lord's Supper, drinks the cup, and he doesn't even know juniors are watching him. You know, he's coloring, but out of the corner of his eye, he knows the kids are smart. And Dad's reading his Bible about the crucifixion. And they see Dad take off his glasses and wipe a tear out of his eye. You know what? Whatever the preacher said that day probably didn't impact that kid any. But that one tear changed his life. Because this means something to my dad. I've never seen my dad cry before. But he cries at the Lord's Supper. What did I tell you? Hosanna is our watchword. We are all about praising God. You know, the church has two purposes. And the purpose is not to be a social organization. It's not to have graduation parties and birth baskets. Those things are good. I like those things. It's not the purpose of the church. You know what the purpose of the church is? To show forth His praises, 1 Peter 2, 5, and 9, while we exist. And 2 is to show the world His gospel. And whatever doesn't directly relate to that needs to be muted or maybe done away with, because that's the purpose of the church, those two things. All right, let's stop. I started preaching, so I'm going to move back to teaching. So we're back into chapter 21. See if there's anything we really need to mark in this chapter. There's a lot of good stuff here. So I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to mark the days of the week. We're going to jump ahead. So let's start marking the 8 days, Sunday to Sunday of Crucifixion Week. So above chapter 21 writes Sunday, and the key word is cleansing. We're going to have one word to summarize what happened on that day. So Sunday before Resurrection Sunday, so 8 days back. This is Sunday, and Sunday goes from 21:1 down through 21:17. That's all on Sunday. Then Monday starts at 21:18. 21:18. And our word is cursing, because He cursed the tree. Let no fruit grow on thee henceforward forever. Cursing. That's Monday. Tuesday begins at 21:23. 21:23. Now we know more about what happened on Tuesday than any other week before the resurrection day, or the crucifixion and resurrection. You got several chapters that all happen on Tuesday. So beside 21:23, put Tuesday, and then the word is conflict, and then under that until 26:14 is where we start Wednesday. 26:14. So all that is on Tuesday. Two of those chapters is the Olivet Discourse that he preached. So, there's no history there, just the sermon. But still, there's a lot. We know a lot that happened on those 2 days. So then you go over to 26:14 and write Wednesday. Beside 26:14, Wednesday. And under that write quiet. No recorded words, day of rest. No recorded words, day of rest. That's Wednesday. That's beside 26:14, Wednesday. So I guess we could say he took the day off because it's really going to get rough from here on out, right? Or maybe he did stuff we just don't have the record of it, but we don't have any words on that day. Now, Thursday begins at 26:17. 26:17. And this keyword is one problem with writing as a pencil is it fades on you over time. Communion, yeah, because he establishes the Lord's Supper. Communion, the Last Supper. Then I divided up this a little bit. So if you want to, beside verse 47, chapter 26:47, I wrote Thursday night, because now we transitioned to Thursday night. A lot happens on Thursday, and a lot of it's at, after dark. So, and then you got the arrest. It's really a big section there, but I wrote it beside 53, but you could write it really anywhere along in there. He's arrested. And then at verse 57, Jewish trials begin. Jewish trials begin. Jewish trials. So there were Jewish trials and then Roman trials. So you had both, right? So this is, first he went to the Sanhedrin first. That's the Jews. Then Friday begins at 27:1. 27:1 is Friday. And the key word there is crucifixion. Crucifixion. 27:1, Friday, crucifixion. And beside verse 2, right, Roman trials. Roman trials. Because now they've taken him to Pilate. Governor Pilate is the Roman. So the Jews couldn't kill anybody because they were an oppressed people. They had to get the Romans to sign off on it. So they are now going to the Roman government and say, this guy we've condemned in our courts, he deserves to die, but we've got to have your permission to do it. And so Pilate eventually gives in and kills him. That's why he's killed by crucifixion. Jews didn't crucify. Jews stoned to death. Sometimes other things, but never crucifixion. Primarily stoning. That's why the Old Testament prophets talked about they shall look on him whom they have pierced. If they stoned him to death, that prophecy would have gone unfulfilled. And he might not have even bled. But the crucifixion guaranteed he would be pierced and bleed. So God figured all that out, of course. So that's Friday. And Friday goes all the way down to 27:61. 27:61. So besides 62, write Saturday. And under that, write calm. He's in the grave the whole day. Saturday's in the grave. And then 28:1, write Sunday. Very early in the morning, he's resurrected. So you've gone Sunday to Sunday, 8 days. You can do this with Mark, Luke, and John. It's not as easy, at least it may just be because I haven't studied them as much as Matthew. But you can do this with the others, but I can't give you all that yet. I've done some of it, but I haven't finished it. But let's go back now to 21. We're on Sunday. And go through some of this. So we saw our key verse, and we saw the title, and we saw our life lesson from it. So the only thing that we're doing today, since we're not doing the outlines today, is just some notes. So I have put in verse 3, underline and quotation marks around, the Lord hath need of them. That's a great sermon. I preached that sermon. Probably got it. I'm sure I got it from somebody else. But the Lord hath need of them. And the point is, Jesus, when he was on earth, borrowed things from people, like a boat, like the boat that he went out in the water and preached to the people on the bank in Luke 5. He needed a boat. A colt, he borrowed a colt to go into Jerusalem. Here, the triumphal entry, he didn't own a donkey. But the prophet said he was going to do that, so he borrowed one. And he borrowed a room to have the Lord's Supper, Last Supper in, Luke 22:10. He borrowed a tomb to be buried in. You know, who could borrow a tomb, you know? I mean, you can borrow my car, but if you borrow my grave, that's. But Jesus didn't need it but for 3 days. Let me borrow your tomb. Actually, I only needed it for about 37 hours. That's how long he was in the grave. Best I could tell. But here are your applications to that. The Lord has need of things from you and me. The Lord needs me. He needs something I have. Yeah, he does. He needs your influence. Matthew 5:14-16. He needs your worship. John 4:24. He needs your time. Ephesians 5:16. He needs your service. Romans 12:1. He needs your money. 1 Corinthians 16:2. The Lord has need of it. The way He set up His kingdom is that it is citizen supported. Citizen supported. If we don't do it, it doesn't get done. Now, He will help us do it through His providence, but He won't do it for us. You know, when Saul of Tarsus was on the road to Damascus, he had to see the resurrected Lord in order to qualify to be an apostle. So the Lord appears to him, Acts 9. Who art thou, Lord? I'm Jesus. Jesus, that's the name he hated above all names. He was trying to stamp it out. And then he said, well, Lord, what would thou have me to do? Well, those are two most important questions you can ever ask. Who is Jesus? Who art thou, Lord? And what do you want me to do? You know, the Lord didn't answer that second question. The Lord could have said, well, you need to go be baptized. He did. He said, go in the city, and it'll be told thee what thou must do. Somebody will come and tell you, but not me. I'm not going to tell you. Why not? Because He gave us that job. He said, go in all the world, preach the gospel to every creature. That's us. So instead of telling, it would have been easier. It's a lot of times with your kids, it'd just be easier to do it than tell them to do it and show them how, right? Just do it. But it's not good for them to do that. So it's more trouble, but do it the right way. That's what Jesus did. It'd been easier just to tell Saul right there, right then, but He didn't. He said, go to the city, somebody will come tell you. And then He goes over here to Ananias and says, I want you to go tell Saul. And Ananias didn't want to go. I've heard about this guy. He left Jerusalem. Before he got to Syria, they heard he was coming and what he was going to do when he got there. He's going to try to arrest us. We're trying to hide from Him, Lord. I don't want to go. No, He's a chosen vessel for me. You go. So He did. Just like Mark 16:15-16 says, He went over to the sinner and told him what to do to be saved. He baptized and became a Christian. So the Lord has need of us. That's the whole point. All right, the next one. Well, I think I'm going to go to the next chapter. So let's go to 22. 22. We're going to call 22, Jesus silences His enemies. Let's see that in 22:42. So go ahead and go to the end of the chapter. Not 42, but 46 rather. No man was able to answer him a word. So they've been coming at Him left and right. They've been challenging Him, and he's won every battle, you know, and nobody's been able to get the best of it. And no man was able to answer Him a word, neither durst any man from that day forth ask Him any more questions. They're done asking Him questions now. They decided it's fruitless. We can't beat Him. Now they're going to keep opposing Him, but they're not going to do so openly with words. Now He's going to take it to them in chapter 23, though. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. 8 times He says that. Generation of vipers, blind guides. You know, He's going to really let them have it. But in 22, our key verse is 42. So circle the number 42 and then underline, what think ye of Christ? Whose son is He? That's an important question. It's just like Saul's question in Acts 9:6. Who art thou, Lord? What do you think of Christ? It's the same thing. So that's the question we got to answer. Everybody's got to answer that question. What do you think of Christ? Is He the Son of God or not? Well, before you can go to heaven, you got to be asked the question. And before you can go to heaven, you got to answer it right. But before you can answer it right, you got to be asked it. And you got to study it. So that's our job. Our job is not to convert everybody. Our job is to tell everybody. Tell them. Let them choose, and a percentage of them will receive it. And we've got to set a good example and be the most persuasive we can, but ultimately it's on them to make the decision. We cannot decide for even our own spouse, even our own children. It's still a personal decision. So, whose son is Christ? Is he God's son? Then, our life lesson from chapter 22 is render to God what is God's. That's 22:21. That's when they ask him, I'll just read it. 22:21 says, well, back up for their question, verse 17. Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? Now, that's going to be a tricky question. Because people get pretty fired up about taxes, right? Especially when it's an enemy that's opposing you, that's subjected you, has you under their thumb, and they're charging you a lot of taxes. So, do we have to pay these taxes or not? So Jesus says, show me a penny. So show him a penny, a Roman penny. And he holds it up and says, whose image is on that? They look at it. Well, they already know. Well, that's Caesar's. Caesar's. Okay. Well, if it's got his picture on it, give it to him. Render to Caesar what's Caesar's. Now, what picture's on you? In the image of God made he man. True or false? That's true. We're made in the image of God. Render to God what's God's. You belong to God. He made you in his image. So, give yourself to God. Render to God what is God's. God also has the right to our money. No. For me to pass the plate down and not put anything in there on Sunday? Well, that's wrong. Because he said, be generous, be a good steward. Part of that's giving. He needs my voice. He owns my voice, so I need to give him that. So forth. You can do a lot for that. But render to God what is God's. Okay, in this chapter 22, let's observe in verse 4, put quotation marks around all things are ready. We sing a song like that. All things are ready. God has set the table for us. Come to the feast. Come to Christianity. Come to the blessings. All things are ready. And then in verse 9, I put quotation marks around, go ye therefore into the highways. Get out of the building, get out of our houses, go out. Highways and byways, but start with the highways. And verse 5, I skipped something, I'll give you this. There's actually 3 notes. So they made a lot of it, went their ways. One to his farm, that's country people. Country people. Another to his merchandise, that's city people. And the remnant took his servants and treated them spitefully and slew them. That's a few bad apples. You got all kinds of people represented here. Country people, city people, bad people. Well, everybody needs the gospel. I guess maybe just one more thing in this chapter. So let's mark the 3 questions. Circle the word Herodians in verse 16. And then underline their question, is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar? We already covered that. But that's a Herodian question. And then beside that, Roman number 1, first question, political. Each one of these is a different kind of question. The first one is a political question. Should I pay my taxes or not? The Herodians were a political group. You hear the name Herod in the name. So they were political. They were aligned with Herod. He was a bad guy. But they curried his favor. They were Herodians. So their question is political. Now the second, Roman number 2, is put a box around Sadducees, or circle around Sadducees in verse 23. Sadducees, verse 23. And right under that verse, Acts 23:8, which will give you information about Sadducees. They did not believe in the resurrection. They did not believe in spirits or the afterlife. So they were materialists. What you see is what you get. Now, their question, therefore, relates to the resurrection. They didn't believe in the resurrection. So they got a question. They think this will stump him. This will stump him. So their question is in verse 28. Whose wife shall she be of the seven? So just underline that, and then I'll explain why they asked that. They said, so Moses, they bring up the levirate marriage law. So if a man married a woman and they didn't have any kids, then he died. She's a young widow. She has no male offspring from her husband. See, under the Jewish law, the firstborn progenitor received a double portion. Also, he received the inheritance of his father's property. He didn't have a son. So they had the law that said his brother or next of kin. So it starts with the brother, and then there's goes out from there if there's no brother. This is in the book of Ruth. Ruth, the Moabitess, husband died, no son, so she comes back to Bethlehem, and she's gleaning in the field of Boaz, and Naomi finds out that Boaz, she says, oh good, he's a near kinsman of us. And so she coaches her, and she goes to Boaz at night. He's sleeping with the grain, probably so nobody'd steal it. And she uncovers his feet, lays there, and he wakes up. There's a woman at my feet, And then, it's Ruth. It's me, Ruth. Well, what are you here? What are you doing here? Well, you're a near kinsman, and I'd like for you to throw your skirt over me. Or, in other words, will you be my? Will you honor the law that says to raise up a seed to a widow? And he was willing to, but he said, there's a nearer kinsman than me, so I don't have first right. So the next day he asked the other guy, and the other guy wouldn't do it, so he married her. So that's what they're talking about here. And then the first one died, no son. Second one married her, no son. 7 times she got married, and nobody could produce a son with her. The seventh one died, and they said, okay, they all go to the afterlife, which they didn't believe in. Who's she going to be married to over there? Because she was married to all 7 of them. And then this must have really got them, because Jesus said, you do err not knowing the Scriptures. If you read your Bible more, you wouldn't even ask me that question. And then he says, there's no marriage over there. There's no giving in marriage. Nobody's married in heaven. Instead of that being a negative, though, maybe you're thinking, well, I love my spouse so much I can't imagine not being married to them in heaven. Well, instead of it being a negative, it's a positive in this sense. Instead of only having one person you're so close to, everybody will be that close to. Now, it's not physical, so it's not that aspect of it. But the social, the spiritual, you'll still be just as closer to your spouse. But you'll also you're not limited by energy, you're not limited by time, you're not limited by space. You've got everything. So you'll have friendships beyond what we have here. So that's a positive. Third question is, Pharisees, put a box around that in verse 34. And then put a Roman number 3. Oh, did I tell you what the Sadducees? I'm sorry. Second question was doctrinal. I almost forgot that. So beside verse 28, right, Roman number 2, second question, doctrinal. Doctrinal. It was a doctrinal question. And then third question, Pharisees, box, verse 34. Their question is in verse 36, which is the great commandment of the law? And you put Roman number 3 beside verse 36, and you put third question, legal. Third question, legal. So you had a political question, a doctrinal question, a legal question. All right. Now we're going to go into chapter 23. Chapter 23 is woe to the Pharisees. Woe to the Pharisees. The key verse is verse 23, so circle the number 23 in Matthew 23. Woe to you, Pharisees! Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites! For you pay tithe of mint, anise, and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law. Our life lesson from this chapter is watch out for hypocrisy. Verse 13 is one place, but it's all the way through this chapter. So we don't want to be like the Pharisees. Watch out for hypocrisy. Be transparent. Be real. Be genuine. Have faith that's not pretended. Don't be a different person at home than you are at church. Don't have hidden secrets, but be a genuine Christian, sincere. So don't be a hypocrite. Now, in this chapter, I just want to mark the 8 woes with you. So let's do that. Well, beside verse 3, underline this part. Do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. You underline that, and then right beside it, definition of hypocrisy. You want a definition of hypocrisy? They say, but they don't do. That's what hypocrisy is. Now we're going to mark woe, 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 all the way through the chapter. So the first woe is in verse 13. Underline it or circle it, whatever you prefer. Verse 13, verse 14, verse 15, verse 16. There's the first 4 woes consecutively in those verses. So underline woe, 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 woe. 8 woes. The next one is verse 23, which we just mentioned. The next one is 25, 27, 29. So I think that's a total of 8 times he called them hypocrites. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. He also called them blind guides, generation of vipers, fools. I've underlined those also here, but I'm not going to do that with you. But you can do that next time you read it. But I did want to notice with you, called them whited sepulchres also. But verse 33 I've underlined. Serpents. Okay, I'll go over those again. Here are the verses with woe in it. 13, 14, 15, 16, 23, 25, 27, 29. Is that 8? I think that's 8. That's it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, okay. So I'll give them to you again. I'll go slow. So 13, 14, 15, 16. There's 4. Then 23, 25, 27, 29. So that's 8 total. All right, so underline verse 33. Serpents, vipers, can you escape? How can you escape the damnation of hell? This is the strongest sermon Jesus ever preached. In fact, if most preachers preach this sermon, they'd be fired before the day was over. You know, this is strong. But Jesus never hated anybody. He loved the ones he was preaching to. They needed to hear this. So just because we love someone doesn't mean we don't ever say anything to them that might be offensive, might be strong. It means that we do tell them what they need to hear. All right. A couple more things in this chapter, 3 more things. So in verse 35, I underlined 2 letters, not 2 words, 2 letters. A in Abel and Z in Zacharias. And then I wrote beside it A to Z, A to Z. I don't know if this comes across in Greek or not, same, but in English it makes a good point. From A to Z, they had persecuted God's people from A to Z, righteous Abel until the blood of Zacharias. And now all that is going to come back to haunt them because God's going to punish for it. It's almost like a dam. You've got a dam, it's damming up this water, and the pressure's pushing on the dam, pushing on it, it's growing higher and higher, more water's coming. Eventually, it's going to get so much, what's going to happen? The dam's going to break. And when the dam breaks, there's a lot of destruction. So God has been taking this for all these years. He sends prophets to them. They kill them. They persecute them. They put them in prison. They say bad things. They don't repent. This is all building up. And finally, the dam is going to break in AD 70, and the Romans are going to come in and destroy the nation. Josephus says 1 million Jews died in the siege of Jerusalem. They circled the city, wouldn't let anybody in or out. probably an exaggeration. It was not unusual for historians to exaggerate numbers at that time. But it was a lot of people, and they starved them out. And then they came in and burned the temple and melted the gold and all that. So it was a really bad time. And that's what chapter 24 is going to talk about, which we won't have time to do today. But before we leave, let's do 36 and 38, 2 more notes. 36, I have underlined, all these things shall come upon this generation. Underline that. And then generation, there's a disagreement between us and premillennialists about this. A generation, well, here's a note you can put here. Herodias, he's a Roman historian, Herodotus, Herodotus, said that 3 generations fill up a century. 3 generations fill up a century. So a generation is 33 years. So we go back over here. All this shall come upon this generation. He said this in AD 30. We would say a generation is 40 years. 40 years. That's how we define it today. So Jesus is here in AD 33, right? When he died. When did all this come upon them? AD 70. So all it's going to come on this generation. Now, not everybody that was alive that day was there in AD 70, but that generation was still around. And so they suffered it. So that box around 2 words in verse 38, your house. Now, I meant to talk about the cleansing of the temple in chapter 21, but I forgot to do that. But in chapter 21, 13, he says, you have made God's house, speaking of the same building, a house of, well, let me just read it because I might get it wrong. 21:13, my house shall be called the house of prayer, but you made it a den of thieves. So it's my house, or God, his Father's house, the temple. Now, something happened between 21:13 and 23:38. What happened? God moved out. It was his house in 21. It's your house in 23. Now, he's going to destroy that house, but he's not home. He won't be home when the destruction comes. So it's your house. And we will talk about that tomorrow. Now, I know some of you attend other congregations, so let me tell you what I'm thinking, and I decided what to do. Since I didn't get to cover what I wanted to get these 2 chapters. We ran out of time, but that was pretty ambitious anyway. So I think what I'll do in the morning is cover the Olivet Discourse, which are these 2 chapters, during the church services. And then at the 2 to 4 hour, we will deal with the 26, 27, 28. So we got 3 hours. No, we don't, 2 to 4. We got 2 hours, so I have to go fast. But we'll look at the crucifixion, primarily crucifixion and resurrection tomorrow afternoon. So if you're not going to be here, they will be recording it. And I don't know if I have any written notes on these 2 chapters, but I'll look, and if I do, I'll send it to anybody. I'll email it to anybody that wants it. I have some notes in my Bible. I've preached on this a good bit, so I probably got notes somewhere. So I'll see if I do, I'll send it. Let me know I'll send it to you. All right, anybody have anything you want to say before we go? Yeah, you're right. Where is I taught that? That's in Joshua or Judges 1? No, he wouldn't be alive in Joshua or Judges. So must have been. That's when I was teaching Joshua. We read back. You're right. I think it's Exodus 32. It wasn't when I was teaching Joshua's. I wrote a chapter for lectureship on Exodus 32, the golden calf, and that's where he says it, which is interesting. And God, then Moses says, no, they're your people. He doesn't say it that way, but when he responds, he works in that your people again. So God was frustrated with them, and you can imagine, that he would be. So, all right. Anybody else? All right. Thank y'all for coming. This is a marathon. 6 hours? I mean, don't y'all have grass to mow? Don't you have clothes to wash? Food to cook? Don't you have naps to take? I mean, don't you? Well, you're to be commended for this. This your interest. And you're welcome. Love to teach. God's blessed me. I teach you to drop a hat, and I'll drop the hat. You know. So let's be dismissed in prayer, though. Ray, would you lead us in prayer? All right, let's bow together. Amen. Thank you.